First and foremost, congratulations to all 4 teams for breaking and advancing to the semifinal round. In opening government, we have Swinburne 1. In opening opposition, we have UNIMAS 1. Oh, sorry, Swinburne 2 in opening government. In closing government, we have Lodge 2. And in closing opposition, we have XOXO. The motion that stands before the House reads as follows. This House, as the Iraqi government, would cede captured territories to the Islamic State. I call upon the Prime Minister to give a speech not to exceed 7 minutes. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear.
Mr. Speaker, from this motion, we tend to classify this IS as a jihadist organization. We don't label them as terrorist organization because we believe that these people don't just fight for the sake that they want to fight. They don't just go out and kill people just because they want to. They do that for particular reasons. They do that because of what the government have done towards them. And we tell you that some of the reasons why they do that is because they feel that they are being marginalized within the society. They feel that their people are not being represented in the government that is ruling them. They feel that the government is oppressing them in their own particular state. And that is why these people are coming out. They are coming out to fight. They are coming out to make themselves heard by the whole world and by their own government. And that is why we believe that they should be allowed to be on the states that already captured, which is most of the states in the north. And the reasons behind that is you can see examples of where such things have happened. Example, the Tamil Tigers, in order to get them to come to the table, in order for the Sri Lankan government to get them sit down, in order for the government to get them to come and talk and to accept the ceasefire, they have to call them to the negotiating table. And to do that, they have to allow them the particular states which they have captured. And that will actually work in the long run because it provides the organic change. It's not that we are giving them the states in order to create a different state from Iran, but we are giving them that state in order to bring them to the negotiating table, in order to show that the government is willing to talk, in order to show them that the government is willing to recognize them within their own state. And that is why we also tell you about the Iraqi government itself. The fact that the government already recognized this fact that these people are out there means that the government wants to do something about it. And the fact that the Western societies like the US are putting the pressure on the government to solve their problem means that the government wants a quick solution in order to stop the violence that has been going on in this one state. That is why we tell you that we want these people, we want to allow them most of those states in the north which they already captured. Again, I will talk to you about the end goal of this and then how this will actually end the violence in Iraq itself. How is it going to end the violence? Before that one.
It is important for you to first outline to us who represents ISIS, who are they fighting for, and what they're fighting for.
No, the fact is I already told you that these people are jihadist organizations. They are fighting because they feel that their own people are being marginalized. They are fighting because they feel that they are not being represented properly within the government itself. Cool. And that is why, sit down. Again, we tell you that no matter the crimes that these people have committed, they did that because of a particular reason. On the note on what these people are trying to do, which means, how will it end the violence in Iraq? Now, we tell you that these people have been recognized by the Iraqi government, and the government already knew that the violence is already out there for them. And there is no win-win situation in this, because if they continue the war and they don't go on with this other situation, if they continue the war, the fact is, you find a situation whereby the Western nations already will also come inside their nation and still bombard them. So we are telling you that we are providing a situation whereby we want to call them to the negotiating table. We want to make sure that they take the option to cease fire. We allow them the states that are already captured with the option of them stopping the violence that they're committing. And in the long run, the government negotiates with them secretly and allow the organic change to happen in the society itself. Sit down. So, because this will also create an inclusive government, it will help the government to make sure that these people are being represented within their own state. It will help the government to create this solution whereby these people, they will make sure that they are being represented in the government itself. They will make sure that most of them are being represented. The government wouldn't be able to ignore them. Take a situation whereby the last time one of their top executives was represented in the parliament, and within few months after they left, after the US left the place, what happened? The prime minister, Malachi or something, have to accuse that top official of committing a crime, of committing the terror crime against the nation. And then their people cannot see that guy actually committed the crime. No, they see that as a reason for the government to remove a representative of theirs from the parliament. And that is why we tell you that you have a nation whereby only one particular, only this particular state is being represented in the government. How is it actually going to work? It doesn't happen anywhere. If you take a situation of this country, not only the Malians are represented, the Chinese are represented. So if you take that particular situation, you know that the fight will continue to go on until the government actually provide a proper recognition for this particular group. And if the government does not do that, they will continue the fight. And the fact that the government is willing to negotiate with them, this is an opportunity for the government to actually do that. This is an opportunity for the government to come out and say, yes, we recognize these people. This is an opportunity for the government to come out and say, yes, we want to stop the killings, we want to stop the violence. Because by the time you continue to classify them as terrorist organizations, they continue to do what they are doing. And we tell you that these people are being influenced through the Al-Qaeda group. It's not that they really want to see what they are doing. That we need to protect their own people. That we need to protect their own people. Take for instance, one of the states that already captured, that the traffic officers, that making sure that they provide social welfare to the states that already captured, which the government was not providing to that particular state before they captured the state. So the fact that these people are able to do this shows that they actually care about their own people. The fact that the people of Iraq itself is showing that they want this thing to happen, that they are showing their discomfort with what is going on in their own nation itself. It shows that it's time for the government to come to the table and talk with these people and negotiate with them and find a way. And we tell you that the easier way to do that is to call them to the table. How do you call them to the table? Allow them most of the states that are already captured in the north itself. By allowing them those states, you are actually giving them the idea that you recognize the fact that they exist. You don't brand them as a terrorist organization. Thank you.
Thanks to the Prime Minister for his remarks. I now call upon the Leader of the Opposition to open opposition's case. Here.
Yeah.
Mr. Speaker, members of this House, side opening opposition in the strongest possible manner, reject any appeasement towards ISIS, we reject any secession of any lands of Iraq to ISIS, Mr. Speaker, and we have very good reasons for it. What is our position in this debate? We think and we acknowledge that Iraq has its problems and birthing pains with regards to its path to democracy, Mr. Speaker. But we do not think ISIS is part of that solution. And we think the outcomes of appeasing ISIS will be far, far worse than whatever is happening in Iraq today. What will I talk to you in my speech today? Firstly, I'll characterize to you what ISIS is as a situation on the ground, which is not sorely lagging from opening government, right? In terms of argumentation, I'll tell you why. Now, firstly, that ISIS has not fulfilled the basic criterions or yardsticks for the formation of an independent state. That's something that's been recognized by the international community.
Yes,
secondly, I'll talk to you about the legitimacy problem that ISIS face, why it's going to be incredibly problematic for us to recognize them, right? And lastly, I'll tell you how this particular policy weakens Iraq incredibly, and it's very difficult for it to be viable as a state, right? But what do we stand for in terms of the solutions in this particular debate, right? We think there are a few other alternatives we can pursue. We think these are largely hard actions with regards to international intervention, right? We're talking about anything ranging from the assassination of ISIS's leaders with regards to intervention. It could be NATO, it could be the Arab League. We think the more collaborative this effort is, the better, Mr. Speaker. But we think the difference between both sides is that we will not make compromises to ISIS under any circumstances, regardless of the means in which they've approached robbing land from Iraq, right? Mr. Speaker, before moving into characterization, a few rebuttals, right? We think the assumptions that the opening government has made has been faulty, right? They made the assumption thinking that that we can offer ISIS something that it hasn't already been able to achieve on its own. It has already been able to capture land without coming to the table, Mr. Speaker. It has done so through violent means. What carrot are you providing to ISIS to come to the table, given that they've already captured a large part of Iraq already, Mr. Speaker, and given that they want to capture even more of Iraq and expand further, right? Why would they want to come to the table to agree to your terms, which they never wanted to begin with, right? Which is just one piece of it, which is just limiting their expansion towards Iraq only. We think they want far more than what you're willing to give. They have no incentive to come to the table and talk, right? We think appeasement only grants them more leverage to continue what they want to do, which is incredibly harmful, right? Sit down, Kevin. Let's go into characterization. Let's look at three parts, right? Firstly, Iraq. We think we recognize their birthing pains, we recognize that sectarian violence, and there's weak central government. These are all a symptom of being new to democracy and a symptom of years and years of dictatorial regime, right? We think they're also unfortunately trapped in the regional instability with regards to Syria, and that's also spilled over to Iraq, right? We think the US is also heavily invested in Iraq. We don't think it's like an hijack like ISIS, right? We think that even though this problem exists, we think there is international support. Compromises have been broken between insurgent groups right, in Iraq. We think that's incredibly good. We should continue in that direction, right? Who is ISIS? We recognize they've captured large amounts of land, right? We recognize their leader is despotic and irrational. He thinks that he is the one leader, he is a rational actor who will come to the demands, given that he thinks that he should be the leader of all Muslims, right? We don't think he's rational. We think the gains have been gained through violence. We think there's little we can afford him, that hasn't already gained on his own. But most importantly, Mr. Speaker, he has explicitly stated that his regime is expansionist in nature. He wants to capture land, moving from, including Israel to Turkey, right? When he's expansionist in nature, we don't think he will stop simply at Iraq, right? Equally fights, Mr. Speaker, right? We think there's been terrorized submission in many towns. They've been carried out beheadings in towns square, Mr. Speaker. We don't think the people necessarily support ISIS, but are not making it clear because they are afraid of their lives for doing so, right? We don't think they're welcoming ISIS in this particular scenario, right? First argumentation, ISIS does not fulfill the basic criterion for the formation of an independent state. What is this criterion, right? You need to have defined territories to begin with. ISIS has no defined territories. In fact, that is very fluid. They want to capture as much as they want, right? We think with regards to how we recognize territories, look at how Palestine, which is for the aspect of recognition, right? There's defined territories, there's agreed terms, right? I think that's important to recognize. Secondly, you need to have a functional government and a clear leadership, Mr. Speaker. We don't think ISIS has that, right? We don't think it's a representative government. We don't think there's any form of elections that they're going to have, right? We think it's a government that recognizes only one leader as a supreme leader with no form of check and balance to his power, right? But apparently you think there's little to no international recognition, right? We look at how Palestine took a lot of effort. Look at a lot of effort to go to getting that international recognition. ISIS does not have that. They will never be a functional state, right? Second argumentation in terms of legitimacy. I'll take one POI now.
The reason why you're not recognized as a legitimate state is because of continuous influence of Al-Qaeda over there. Recognizing their proper state right now and allowing for proper governance of the state will give greater stability to avoid terrorist links, to avoid greater terrorist influence of such a state.
The reason why they're not recognized as legitimate states, not because they are linked to Al-Qaeda. In fact, Al-Qaeda, I said these guys are way too extreme, right? Even they think they're too extreme, right? These guys have gone to the extent of being willing to kill other Muslims to achieve their cause. They are so extreme, Mr. Speaker. Even Al-Qaeda has said these guys are too much. We can't handle them, right? That's why we think they've lost legitimacy. Even among extremists, Speaker, right? We think in terms of legitimacy, right? We think with regards to legitimacy, we think firstly, right? We don't think ISIS has any legitimate claim over Iraqi land. Why? Because the means to which they have acquired those lands is illegal, right? They've overthrown legitimate governments through violence, through and taken advantage of opportunistically taken advantage of weak authorities and weak militaries in particular areas, right? We think there's no demonstration of popular support. We don't think they're ever going to demonstrate there's popular support for the particular regime. So we don't think they have any legitimate claim over Iraqi land, besides the fact that they happen to be able to control it because of circumstances that happen to favor them, right? Secondly, we don't think ISIS is a legitimate actor to begin with, right? We think because they employ violence, because there's absolutely no recognition of human rights, there's no recognition of the basic principles of democracy, Mr. Speaker, we do not think they're a legitimate actor to be able to grant these things, right? But lastly, and most importantly, Mr. Speaker, also, is that Iraq cannot afford to cede this land to ISIS, Mr. Speaker. Why? We think ISIS has already taken control of a lot of northern land. Right? We're talking about important power sources. We're talking about vital cities. We're talking about trade hubs, such as Mosul, right? If Iraq were to say that your gains right now are yours and you can keep it, we do not think Baghdad alone can survive as a viable state, Mr. Speaker. I think for all those reasons, Mr. Speaker, because they have fulfilled the basic tenets of what an independent state should be, because there's no legitimacy, and because Iraq will not be viable if they succeed, accede to these demands, we are very, very proud to oppose.
Thanks to the opposition for his remarks, and I'll call upon the Deputy Prime Minister to continue the government's case. You're here.
Speaker, sir, what I'm going to do for side opening government to extend our case further is explain why this is a perfect situation in which we will allow for greater legitimacy to recognize the Sunnis under the IS itself, but more importantly, how they would be encouraged and how they would take up this opportunity to actually stop the bloodshed as well. Something that probably side opening opposition has yet to decide. What they further want to actually, in fact, want to propose is to increase the bloodshed right now by including the interventions by NATO or interventions, if you have read up a bit better right now, the fact that the US has actually enforced the Iraqi military right now by actually sending over advisors, drones, and actually the fact that they're willing to actually bombard IS out of the face of the earth right now. We don't believe that's a viable option, especially if you want to protect the minorities of Sunnis within the Iraqi state right now, right? But more importantly, before I get into that idea, let's point out a few different responses that we've yet to hear from side opening opposition, right? The fact that standing borne out to you that the Iraqi government under the Prime Minister Nuri al-Maliki right now, right? Not Maliki, right? And in this situation, that they're facing all the Western pressure, being pressured by Secretary of State John Kerry to actually include Sunnis within the government right now, to recognize that the people that consist in IS are actually Iraqis to begin with, needs to be heeded, right? And this is very inconsistent. The fact that the American government wants to recognize the people under the IS, right? That the people under the Islamic State, the Sunnis, need to be recognized right now. The fact you want to continue to attack them, to bombard them, to actually wipe them off the earth right now, and constantly fight for military action isn't really consistent with the American approach, isn't really consistent with the global approach regarding IS, right? They believe that IS have legitimate grounds to actually fulfill certain things, and they also believe that the Iraqi government hasn't taken enough measures, right? They haven't provided to us a proper analysis into the current status quo to show how the Iraqi government has taken enough measures to try to resolve the issues regarding IS itself. We're going to show you how they can take it even further. Not yet. right? Another thing they haven't really responded to this idea was that there isn't only external and actually international pressure, but there's a lot of pressures within the Iraqi government to also recognize IS, more importantly, right? The Grand Ayatollah and cleric, the most recognized cleric within the Iraqi government in the Iraqi state right now, has already urged that not only Shia should represent the government, but also the Sunnis, more importantly, and the minority Kurds within the IS right now. They asked who, this is exactly who. We thought they read better, we thought they should know better to begin with, right? But before that, a number of other responses to Albert and what he pointed out to begin with, right? The fact that they lack legitimacy, and this is exactly what I'm going to respond to later on, how when the Sunnis, other Sunnis and Kurds under the Islamic State do accept this offer right now, that they can be accepted as Iraqis, accepted as a proper state in its own. But more importantly, the leader you speak of, leader of al-Baghdadi to begin with, isn't really recognized as the formal leader of the state. The fact that it was a recent poll actually conducted over the IS states and IS followers don't accept him for his extremist views to begin with, and don't accept him as a form of representative of IS. IS has a specific goal, something they haven't really problematized. They're not really extreme Al-Qaedas. They're not even worse than Al-Qaeda to begin with, that decide they actually want to kill everyone over the Islamic State. They have a specific reason, and let's characterize them appropriately in the situation. That the fact that they are being marginalized from the Iraqi government, consisting mostly of the majority Shias in such a government right now, that they believe that they don't have a chance at the government. Most people opt, and jihadists more importantly, most people opt to commit jihadism the moment they feel threatened, the moment they feel they cannot be actually represented within the government, and that's why we need to solve the problem, not really consistently trying to wipe them off. Right? Albert,
right. You are assuming that the dissatisfaction to the current Iraqi government translates into support for ISIS. How is that so?
Here. This isn't really a form of support. This is a form that they need to actually compromise, which is extremely crucial, especially when you speak of a democratic government to begin with. This is one of the elements of democracy, that the parliamentary system needs to be compromising to begin with and not totally oppressive towards the nature of what they view and what they want to brand ISIS to begin with, right? Which leads me naturally to my argumentation that they are constantly being branded, if you really want to believe worse than Al-Qaeda right now, it's based on its purpose in this situation. The fact that they're continually recognized as jihadists and unrecognized as a proper state of pretty much being branded as rebels, just like what's going on, what happened in Libya, what happened in Syria right now, or even in the Ukraine, more importantly. This is where a lot of external influence comes in. This is where Al-Qaeda come in and influence and tell them that you should really wipe the Iraqi government off the Iraqi state in this current sense of being. We need to combat this external influence and tell them that no, you shouldn't go under an extreme leader, you shouldn't be influenced by Al-Qaeda, and the fact that if you do continue to do so, then there is a form of measure taken against you already, right? 300 advisors from America being flown in, drones approaching and actually obviously spying over the Islamic states, over Nineveh and Kabul right now at the same time. These are all measures that are ready to be taken. America is considering to actually wipe them out as well at the same time. These are measures to deter them to actually come into Baghdad to begin with. The reason why they haven't taken over Baghdad is because the military hasn't had enough time to respond to them, but now they're extremely ready, well supplied by arms, well supplied by troops more importantly, having a strategic position to really strike back against Islamic State. If you give them the chance, they will, and they will very likely be successful at doing so. And this is something that Islamic State needs to adhere to, needs to listen to right now, and know that if they do not take this opportunity to be recognized as a proper state, this is where they will actually cease to exist afterwards. But even further, no thank you, but even further, this is the whole idea whereby and a lot of sectarian issues of beheadings. This isn't just beheadings of any other Muslims. They've been easily targeting a lot of Shias in the northwest and northern Iraq in this very situation right now. And the reason why they're doing so is because this exclusion of the government, exclusion of themselves from the government right now, consists of a lot of situations whereby they feel ostracized, they feel oppressed, they feel marginalized. Something from Stanley that hasn't really been dealt with so far, and you want to actually oppose them very violently. But more importantly, the fact that they want to actually sustain themselves and sustain their own sects at the same time, they need to recognize that there's not only the people within the Islamic State that need to be protected, but Sunnis everywhere else in the world, more importantly within the current Iraqi government, more importantly those that are in Baghdad as well. But last but not least is the whole idea, apart from avoiding bloodshed, avoiding the idea that they have constant Iraqi links and being branded as terrorists to begin with, or it's like opening opposition actually believe. This is where they actually can come into the table and negotiate once more. The fact that they're recognized as a legitimate force, the fact that they are given territory, the fact that the Iraqi government is making this concession right now, that these are people that need to be heard. These aren't jihadists alone without any proper purpose. These aren't terrorists to begin with. These were Iraqis to begin with. These were Iraqis and Syrians to begin with that needs to be heard, that wants to be heard in this very instance. How are they going to be heard is very easy. This outcome is very simple. The moment they take this opportunity to stop the bloodshed, to have a ceasefire for the very goodness sake, to begin with would actually lead for greater recognition that they're willing to actually come to the table. But more importantly, the moment you give them a legitimate stance, legitimate image, that they're not just any other rebels right now, they are a proper state to begin with, shows that the international community needs to heed towards their needs, more importantly right now, and not to constantly ask NATO to bombard them at the same time. This isn't a win-win situation. This is the Western method of avoiding any sort of conflicts. This is the US coming in once more and telling them that we're oppressing the Middle East. This isn't what we're supposed to do. Let's recognize them for goodness sake and tell them that we can listen to them, more importantly. Thank you.
Thanks to the Deputy Prime Minister for his remarks, and I call upon the Deputy Leader of the Opposition to continue the Opposition's case. Here.
No, Kevin, you will not get away with your crimes towards humanity. Mr. Speaker, we're looking at a Middle East that has just come out from the Arab Spring, a region that has wholeheartedly wanted to accept the importance on how is it that the individual rights should be looked at, should be recognized, and that be it that the Arab Spring could succeed or not, that there should be this notion of democracy within the region. Several things of which I'm going to do to you to extend the win that Herbert has already taken for us, right? One, we're going to talk to you about how is it that the current monarchy administration is something of which can be fixed, can be improved upon, right? In terms of the so-called scenario that ISIS is in with them right now. Secondly, I'm going to talk to you about how is it that the geopolitics has never been decided upon appeasement, how appeasement has failed, and what is in the best interest of Iraq moving forward. Third of all, I'm going to talk to you then about how is it that this further leads to its major consequences, not just to Iraq, but also towards the Middle East in general, in terms of peaceful development, right? So that's what we're going to do. But first of all, let's look at a few rebuttals of which we have to aim at Kevin. It is important for us to clarify that if your sole problem is that their voices are not being heard, and that the al-Maliki administration, for that matter, is a bit screwed up, then we would say that there's always a mediation that could be done by the international party in order to fix that, right? We could say that instead of using violence, if your problems are with about protecting Iraqi interests, then perhaps we should include these people by having them form a political party over creating maximum bloodshed by just simply creating a new Iraq, right? We don't think Iraq version 2 is that good in that matter. For that point, we're saying that why is that so? Because we're saying that under a political system, would you actually have a clear manifesto stating who exactly that you're representing, what exactly you want to achieve, and what are the so-called interests of which you're going to have. All of that happening under a system of which there will be a healthy check and balance about what is it that you can and cannot do. Now, why is that important for that matter, right? It is important, Mr. Speaker, solely because that we fight for tolerance, right? Tolerance on how is it that we recognize that there is sectarian violence in Iraq. In fact, the whole of Middle East between Sunnis and Shias, much like how we see that is happening within Syria, right? How is it that the Basat conflict has created this tension between Sunnis and Shias in terms of the bloodshed, and we don't want to see that happening within Iraq itself. That is why inclusion and tolerance is much better, because at least that there is a legal protection, right? And who are we to say that Malaki's administration cannot call for international assistance, for example, to boost up its security and make sure that no abuse will actually happen, right? Not just against external threats, but also to include stability on the domestic front, right? On how is it that security could be better improved if there was no war in the very first place. Not yet having you had your chance 7 minutes. So what we're going to do here is that, first of all, let's talk about this current Maliki administration on how is it that inherently problematic, right? They're problematic because there is a fear, right? A fear that even though that this is a Shia-dominated politics within the Iraqi sphere, we already know that from the remnants of the Iraq War, for example, how is it that Sunnis and Shias can no longer tolerate one another as before? Because no matter what happens, there has never been a political system whereby it includes the interests of both, right? One being that the Shias have always been the leadership core within the Iraqi system, right? On how is it that that has created an imbalance on how is it that there is a Sunni majority instead, and how is it that their interests are not always represented on the equal ground. That is why we say that in the first place, how Saddam Hussein has created this cauldron that he has evolved into a dictatorship. But we're saying no, The US has come in twice for that matter in order to address that imbalance. And we're saying that they're in the best interest right now to actually try to keep this democratic system in place, right? On how is it that the international community could easily be a check and balance towards the Shia minority on how is it they do not abuse their power again on the first stage, and secondly, on how is it they could help the Sunnis create a political system where they are included as well, right? So there is a compromise that could happen. We don't see any analysis coming from their part on how the Maliki administration has failed because they are in the best position to move on now. What is most important here is that, look, what is the alternatives towards the Maliki administration, right? What is going to happen is that there are two versions. One is that we have a failed Iraqi government who now has even less resources in order to develop. And secondly, how is it that there is then this extremist front right on their doorstep that shows no sign of a peace, right? That is the second argumentation we're going to put up. How are we to say that like Nazi Germany, that they're going to stop by just saying that because we gave you Czechoslovakia, you're going to stop destroying the whole Europe? There's no guarantee towards that because you will never start. How is it that this happened, right? Much like Nazi Germany, ISIS is an organization, right, that thrives upon the ideology of what is important for the so-called Germanic people, right? And in this sense, we're saying that there's no even clear standards on what they mean by the so-called Islamic people that they want to protect. Otherwise, what would they want to infringe on the sovereignty on Syria at the same time, right? And how is it that the whole of Aleppo is also under the jurisdiction of ISIS, right? How do you protect the Iraqi people and make sure that it is balanced out with the people from Aleppo at the same time? Because we are talking about people that is modeled in the instant, right? It is a mixed pool of dirty mongrels. Yes, Kevin.
The solution then is that to include ISIS in the democratic elections the moment the world international community still recognize and you're still framing them as terrorist groups, still actually beheading people at the same time. How are they going to be accepted?
Albert has told you that in order to stop that influence, you have to give that legitimacy. That is why he said that instead of beheading, talk on the diplomatic table. But now I'm extending it further to tell you that in order for them to qualify on the seat on the table, they have to be under the law. And the best way to give them legitimacy and the best way for them to operate under the law and know that it is fair is to include them. We're not going to say that they're going to lose in votes if they're representative of the Sunni representative, and then the international community, by including the Arab League, for example, could create a good democratic system for them. Who are we to say that a Sunni majority cannot come out as the new succeeding Iraqi government, right? There is no analysis on how is it. The legal avenues have been exhausted. Everyone has covered you enough on that. So moving on to the second argumentation, right, is that this appeasement will ultimately lead to more violence, right? In the sense that now they're going to have a bigger bargaining chip because they've already told you that they have taken up northern parts of Iraq, that is the industrial hub or the industrial power of the Iraqi economy, right? And knowing that would mean that you are talking about how is it that this bargaining table isn't necessarily equal because now Maliki's government is even less disempowered and less incentivized to try to fight for its post So what is talking about how is it that this expansionist policy coming out from them will also permeate all over the Middle East? How is that so? We've already seen it, and how is it that the people in the Middle East are suffering from intolerance as a result of all of these different conflicts that are happening, right? How is it that they become bigger through the use of the Iraq war, the Afghan war, and how is it that the Arab Spring has created additional tensions because of the new political front of which they have? It's retaliation from the Sunni people, which we have to work for, because are on the table right now. How do we balance that interest? It is to allow a political system that will progressively allow the majority's rights to finally be heard and allow positive rights to protect that minority of which we set in place. Who are we to underestimate who beheads who between the Sunnis and the Shiites? Well, the question is simple. We don't allow them to behead them, we allow them to discuss it first.
Thanks to the deputy of the opposition. We all know it's not a real debate round. It's not a debate with the Nazis.
Thank you.
Moving on, I now call upon the member of government to extend the case on behalf of the government bench here.
So, Mr. Speaker, who are these Sunnis, right? Who are these people who are actually in the Islamic State, actually fighting for their own rights, right? They have been all along history. They have been conducting peaceful campaigns, demanding civil and political rights. They have been doing this actually peacefully, but yet they are being ignored by the government. They are being oppressed by the government. That's why now they have to do something against it. They have to use this more aggressive, more violent way to actually tell the government that their rights need to be protected. So we are telling you that what the Sunnis are doing now is actually legitimate. So therefore, the Iraqi government will have to do something to care for them. Because all these Sunnis wants is to end this job discrimination and have a law where these Sunnis, where they're suspected, they can be tortured on the word of an unknown information. How is this not oppressing the Sunnis? So first, I'll talk to you about how their solution would never work. Because what are they doing? They're providing this solution of an international intervention. But the thing is, these Sunnis, because they are being so oppressed already, they are given no other choice, right? They will still fight back even to their death. They will never ever give in. But under their circumstances, it will only create injected. It will only create more deaths, more fights between this Iraqi state and the Islamic State. So what we are proposing as opening and closing, I'm going to propose is that we want to calm them down. We give them this land, and then we actually calm them down first. Thus, it will be easier to negotiate with them. Because the problem now is these Sunnis are angry. They do not believe in the government anymore. They do not trust in the government anymore. And let me talk to you about the interest of the Iraqi government, right? So the interest of the Iraqi government, most importantly, is of course protect their country as a whole and protect their citizens as a whole. We have to understand that these Sunnis and because are also citizens of the country, but now they want this international intervention, whereas their entire country, all their innocent civilians will also be harmed when in a case there is an international intervention, right? And then they talk about how this Iraqi government is in their interest to actually take down these Sunnis, this Islamic State, because they actually have in hold their vital cities, right? But let me tell you what will happen in case of an international intervention, right? Because when there is an international intervention, these Sunnis will fight back. So there will be an all-out war. The international community will go in and bombard the entire place. And what vital city is done.
Ma'am, what you have to tell us from government is what are the conditions you're going to impose on ISIS if you do agree to give them land, and what incentive do they have to agree to those conditions?
They have incentive, right? Because at the end of the day, as the opening has already proved that the incentive is there as there is already like US troops, drones, and etc. in the Iraqi state. They also have to a certain extent of fear, right? Because they may not 100% win this war, right? So they have this certain fear. So therefore they want to actually accept this offer to actually cease fire and calm themselves down first, and thus we can bring them to the negotiating table through this way. So what are they doing now, right? Because they talk about how it's not mutually exclusive to bring them to the negotiating table, right? I'm not even anymore. So because what is going on now is these two places, the Islamic State and the Iraqi State, both of them are somewhat at war. They are enemies with each other now because the Iraqi State thinks that these are terrorists. They deem them as terrorists. They will not. They actually are fighting them. So these Sunnis, they also think that the Iraqi government are not accepting them. Therefore, it's difficult to actually bring them to the negotiating table through this way. Only through the Iraqi government, actually, some sort of give them a token of recognition. Then they will be able to have at least to a certain extent of trust in the Iraqi government. Because now they talk about how they want them to form a political party, but the thing is, how can these Sunnis trust the Iraqi government? How can they trust unless we make them trust us? So, when the second speaker came up with this alternative, extending their case on this alternative of another party, right? But the problem is they do not understand these Sunnis. They will not. Why would they give up the land that they already have just to form a political party? When what we are proposing is just for them to actually stop expanding. So when they stop expanding, when we have ceasefire, when we calm them down, then we talk to them. We bring them to the negotiating table and we talk to them. Yeah, it's basically what we're proposing. So next I'll talk to you about how there's no other alternative, right? Because this is a problem that we have to solve. Because this is a problem, and it causes a great harm towards Iraq as a whole. Because Iraq has been in war for many years, am I right? We see that ISIS, they actually have the ability to expand. So Iraq is actually under threat now. So, but if you keep on fighting against them, the outcome will still be the same. Just that there will be more deaths. Because why? Iraq will fight against them, they will fight back. Because both sides actually I want to fight, and then the Islamic State may or may not actually conquer these states that are actually lost, and they take it back, and they will still conduct the same thing because ISIS has this ability to actually do this. So therefore, we need the government will need to show some sort of acceptance towards them, thus coming in. Because what all these Sunnis want is representation. All they want is to be accepted by the government because of oppression for such a long time. So I'll talk to you about how the negotiating table is incorrect. Because as the Iraqi state, they have the US, they have backup from US, am I not right? They still have some sort of negotiating power. And these Sunnis, because they have the ability to fight, they're still considered a threat. And they still have these vital cities which Iraqi state actually want. So they too have the negotiating table. So as the negotiating power. So on the negotiating table, at the end of the day, we can protect both sides because both sides have the negotiating power to actually come to acceptance which both sides are more or less happy with, or at least accept. With this, I'm proud to propose. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks to the member of government for remarks. Call upon the member of the opposition to extend opposition's case to your hearing.
When you fail to quail a monster, you don't allow it to breed in your backyard to grow because it'll come back and haunt you.
Yeah.
Few rebuttals. Firstly, on this crazy idea from opposition, right? Their characterization of who ISIS is and what they want. They give us this victim card. ISIS is misunderstood. They're just people who want their rights back. Untrue. Because the places that ISIS have already captured, they set up schools, courts, consumers protection authority, running it like it is their own state. They've committed extreme brutality like crucifixions, beheading and amputating people, uploading videos onto social media, and that is why, in fact, Al-Qaeda spitted them out from Al-Qaeda in the first place. They torture people and they are, in fact, very rich, they are highly organized, they are heavily armed. Those are not characteristics of victims. The moment you let these people breed in your backyard, right beside you, we think they'll just simply use the land to further their aims of achieving a greater Islamic state. True, there are some people who join ISIS because their rights are stepped on by the Shia government, like by Maliki, right? But the core and head leaders of ISIS still wants a greater Islamic state, and that is something that will not change. But the problem is this: OG's model essentially condemns Iraq to falling apart. Why? Because their model has no counter for a worst-case scenario. Recognize this: the risk of negotiation is simply too high. It's irreversible, right? You are giving them the land for negotiation only, not guaranteeing any positive outcome, right? So in the case where ISIS refuses to come to the table and agree with what the Iraqi government wants, there is no reversibility. You cannot tell them, now we want our land back, and you think they will give it back. We don't think that is likely to happen. Even if they agree with your terms, right? We don't think the characteristics of ISIS makes us believe that they will comply with those terms in the long run. No, thank you. Thirdly, the Iraqi military, this is what they say: Iraqi military have the power to rein in and control ISIS. We don't think that is true. If that is true, then if you really have the military might to control ISIS, then what is the incentive for you to give them the land? Recognize that this debate is in the perspective of the Iraqi government. But the fact of the matter is this, sit down. There's no power in the Iraqi military to withhold ISIS. Right? In fact, they're looking for the Kurds to help, and of course the Kurds are not helping them. You allow this militants to fester in your own region, and we think that's bad. But the worst thing is this: by doing and ceding your land to the ISIS and the Sunni militants, you burn all bridges with the international community, and you leave yourself no way back. I'll talk to you 4 fresh analysis. Firstly, does ceding the land solve the problem? And we'll no, thank you. And then we'll talk about the relationship of the Iraqi people with the Iraqi government. But before that, yes, a few items.
Fine. If they do, once we do concede the land to the IS, so the moment they actually breach and they still want to invade Baghdad, wouldn't that mean they have to hold greater accountability and there's greater legitimacy over taking actions against them if they break the conditions of these?
No, you're talking as if ISIS is a responsible government that's going to take accountability of their actions. So if they're killing people, crucifying them, and uploading videos, that's just not going to happen. Let's talk about Iraqi people and the government. What do you portray and tell your people when you see the land? The most important thing, that the first message that you send is that we are in a state of concession. We are a weak government. We've allowed this problem to happen. Now we can do no shit, and we'll give them the land that they want. And the problem with that is this: you allow more people, the moderate Sunnis, who recognize now that the Iraqi government cannot protect them, you allow all these fence-sitters and moderate people to defect and turn and join ISIS, or to even, in fact, to turn to join other extreme militant groups. Secondly, we think it's an easy way out for these governments to just wash off their hands, right, onto international relationships and their problem. They don't assume the accountability that, in fact, the Iraqi government and Maliki has allowed the problem to fester in the first place. Second argument, why you burn all bridges with the international community, and why is that bad? On the first level, you allow a ground to breed terrorists. You dampen the diplomatic ties relationship with the Western world, right? So why is US now willing to send in drones and in fact send in people and diplomats and all that to help quell the ISIS problem? Because US has a direct stake in curbing the influences of terrorists in the Middle East. The moment you give them the breeding ground for ISIS to even further expand, right, you burn the bridges with US. Now you lose your only leverage to defend yourself in future, right? So in future, when you lose US as an ally, the only time US will come in and intervene when ISIS, causes problem again is when US itself has an interest in it. So Iraq itself will not be protected anymore. No, thank you. And not only US, on the second level, you also burn your bridges with the rest of the Islamic world. ISIS is a common enemy in the Middle East. Iran hates them, Al-Qaeda disown them, moderate Sunni Saudis like the Turkeys also hate them. There's no help or ally left for Iraq in the Middle East. But thirdly, the third argument, sit down, you embolden other militant sects. Force, now you're telling people this all over Middle East and the Islamic world, that force can be used as a legitimate political tool. As long as your means are bloody and violent enough, you will get what you want. That is not a message that we can afford. Because if you recognize the current situation, the Kurds want their own land, the Shias want their own, the Shia militants, right, are also arming themselves to defend themselves against ISIS. You have Iran and Syria, who are the Shia majority, threatened by ISIS. You have Lebanon and Hezbollah, who are also fighting with the ISIS, right? So when you embolden all these people and tell them, look, there's a precedence here that ISIS got what they want because they were violent enough, you fester violence in all these other sects and tell them, maybe you should try and be more violent too. You also distort the ability for the Arab League to work with the West. Now you cannot have the ability to broker deals with the West anymore because the West recognizes that Iraq has failed to rein in the problems. The conclusion is this: you have caused a huge vicarious liability onto not only the international community but also to Iraq itself. We think it's heinously unfair to subject the West to the further pressure to come in and rein in ISIS and to subject the West to the threats of terrorism, to subject your people and your civilians to bloodbath in the long run. We don't think that is something that you want. We're very proud.
Thanks to member of the opposition for remarks. Call upon the government to conclude government's case. Your turn.
What side opposition here wants is a hard stance against ISIS. However, what we believe is that since that will not work, why should we continue the violence? Why should we continue the bloodshed? We would rather have more peaceful, a more likely method to solve this problem. First of all, a few rebuttals towards what closing opposition has just said about talking about the problems that will arise under our paradigm. About, first of all, how it would embolden other militants to use force as a legitimate political tool. Why? Because we tell you that it's not really, this idea is no longer new to these militants, and we tell you that these militants, they're already using force, even if we cede this land to ISIS, we tell you that this idea is no longer something new to these militants, and just by ceding this land to them, it won't make them necessarily, even if they continue their violence, it's not necessarily such a marginal harm, because it already is happening now. And we tell you that you have to understand the position of these people in ISIS who have been discriminated against, who are actually oppressed, and you have to understand that this is why they are fighting back in the way that they are now. They keep what these people are a misunderstood people, and side opposition refuses to recognize that. Now, a few the true who these Sunnis are actually. Why? Because what they keep telling us is that they're terrorists, that they're not legitimate governments and all that, and they keep telling us, they keep telling us that these people, we cannot give them the land because they keep wanting to expand further, and how by giving the land we're actually encouraging them and all that. But you have to understand that the fault lies with the Iraqi government in the first place, because initially there was when President Maliki was put into power, he was entrusted to care for all his citizens, and unfortunately he did not do that. He marginalized all the Sunnis. He made policies that were very for the Shia people, and we tell you that because of that, the Sunnis' rights, what the Sunnis want, they have not been granted their rights, such as job opportunities and all that, and this is what they have been fighting for. And although they initially tried to fight for it peacefully, it did not work, and which is why they have now resorted to a violent means to obtain what they want. And we tell you it's not necessarily their fault, because they have been wronged by the government in the first. It was the fault of President Maliki for not catering to their needs in the first place. Yes.
Iraqis on the ground are unhappy with the current government because they felt that the Sunnis lack representation. Given that ISIS is not a democracy to begin with, how much more representation do you think that Iraqi Sunnis are going to get in the ISIS government?
How much more? Well, first, how much more representation are they going to get in the ISIS government? We tell you that, well, no, if you give them the land, here is what will happen. They will have a chance to actually make a mini government of their own, where they can take where they can decide to, where they can police their own affairs, and we tell you that this is better for them. Why? Because they can now why? Because by giving them this land, we've already recognized, we're recognizing that these people have needs that have to be made, that these people have been oppressed, and now we are telling them, we have heard your voices, we're giving you a chance, we're giving this land to you, and this, by this recognition to them, is good, because it will give them, it will be a chance to bring them to the negotiating table. And we tell you that even if it does not bring them to the negotiating table, at least the bloodbath will be ended. Why? Because under their side, what they are proposing is NATO interventions by NATO, international interventions, and we tell you that this will not work. It has not worked, and why continue the bloodbath? Why continue the bloodshed? Why continue the violence, the killings of all these people for an uncertain end result? Because what we tell you is, under the government side, we guarantee you that the marginal benefits are better both ways, even if, because when we give them the land, it will already be more incentive for them to come to the negotiating table, now that they see that we are recognizing their rights, we are recognizing what they want, and we tell you that even if they refuse to do so, and even if they try and keep expanding their land and all that, we tell you that US still has the might to for counter-terrorism, and US still has forces that can counter them. And we tell you that even then, and let's say if they do not do that, and they still have the land, then at least they would have had the chance to set up their mini government. They will have the chance to actually have more representation for their people, instead of what they want on their side, which is just hardline going against them. Yes.
Given that your OG have said that how they are jihadists, extremists, and also how they're extremely anti-Sunnis, how is it that under your paradigm would the Sunni population then not be massacred to bits as a result of them coming to power now?
The thing is, these people, they are viewed by jihadists. They are viewed by jihadists by the world. Why? This is they have been viewed wrongly. Why? Because we have already told you that their initial intention was to fight for their rights. The fact that they are jihadist terrorists, that's this misconception of the world against them, and we tell you that these are very oppressed people. The fact that now you give them the chance, that you actually recognize their rights, we don't get how it will make them kill more Sunni people who are like one of their own. We don't exactly get that. So anyway, moving on about how under our paradigm, under government, we will achieve more end results in the future. How even if, let's say, the end result is not necessarily what we want, we will reduce the bloodbath instead of what they are proposing, when you continue killing people, but in the end achieve nothing at all. So please, if you prefer some more practical way, a more practical solution to end this conflict, please go inside government.
Thanks to Governor West for remarks. In opposition with who knows, this is Casey Wolf, debate proper. You're here.
Mr. Speaker, this has been an observation by far. I'm going to do a couple of things for you. But before we do any of that, let's just question a couple of things. Have we seen any sign of ISIS relenting that gives us the remote possibility that any form of negotiation in the status quo might work? No. Who exactly is the government of Iraq responsible to? And we tell you that the majority of its stakeholders are its own people, and therefore the will of the people is very important in these forms of negotiation, something that they conveniently ignore because it contradicts their case. But lastly, we tell you that the side of government fails as a bench because there is no counter model to the worst case scenario of a failure of negotiations, which we think will make the problems far worse than it is in status quo. Firstly, I'll tell you what happens when there's a huge potential for failure, or something that Deborah already talked about. We'll elaborate a bit further. Secondly, does ISIS want to negotiate, and what will happen in that instance? And lastly, what happens when we grant ISIS more legitimacy, and is that good for an overall conflict resolution, peaceful resolution that they want to talk about? Firstly, potential for failure. Number one, in the event these negotiations go sour, the land is already acquired by these forms of terrorists. That means the empowerment already takes place. That means that there is solid justification now that negotiations have failed, that to embolden this us versus everyone else form of mentality. This emboldens and empowers these forms of terrorists to perform even more extreme measures towards its own Islamic groups of people and the rest of the world. What this does is it doesn't quell any form of harms that the ISIS have been actually extrapolating towards its own people. These are the forms of empowerment and emboldenments that we cannot allow to further sustain itself, and it will be catapulted when these negotiations go sour, or if these negotiations go sour. But secondly, the risks are far greater, because you only have one chance in negotiation. It is very, very unlikely that ISIS will perform the Israel-Palestine model, where we continuously meet each other at every different sector of the year. We think one form of failure is enough to tell the world that ISIS is a terrorist group, and these guys will not ever have that incentive to come to the negotiation table, given that they've already acquired these forms of lands. But the reputation of ISIS precedes itself, right? The intent of ISIS has been clear from the get-go. It's about expansion. It is about being extreme in its worst possible sense to the most amount of people, to show the world we mean business. That means this is a breeding ground for terrorists under their forms of negotiations. That means two things. One, in the best scenario where your negotiations work, they still need to prove that there is an incentive for ISIS to now reduce the level of extremisms that they currently employ. And we have seen no form of incentive for ISIS to do that. But secondly, assuming your negotiations work and they do reduce those forms of extremism, is that the be-all end-all case for everyone? There is an after effect, a domino effect towards how the Iraqi government will be seeing something that Deborah specifically spoke to you about, and how exactly this will catapult the idea of a threat to global security, something that is totally conveniently ignored by side government as well. But let's understand this. We're not talking about other forms of militant sects within the Middle East. These are groups that are heavily funded. They are well armed. There is no incentive to ever come to the negotiating table, Mr. Speaker, unlike there are smaller groups that are financially dependent and who need arms, and therefore there is a bargaining chip to pull them in. So, especially when there are already rumors where they're being funded by Saudi Arabia and Qatar as well. So we think there is no room here for negotiation, and even if there is the case, why would they want to compromise on an ideology that they branded themselves with? Secondly, we tell you that they've told us that the Iraqi military is extremely ready now to quell the kinds of extremism they face. One, that is not true. They've just come out of a war. Two, there's racial divisions within these forms of military groups within Iraq. So we don't think that they're capable of quelling any form of backlash as a result of a potential of failure for these negotiations when they take place. But secondly, even if it was true that the Iraqi military is fundamentally ready to quell these types of dangers and these types of extremisms, then why would the Iraqi government perform that first mover initiative to dangle the carrot and bring ISIS to the table if they're well equipped to deal with the kinds of extremism and the kind of violence that may occur? We don't see a bargaining chip here. We don't know why they would want to do this in the first place. Kevin.
Under the status quo, IS is recognized as mostly consisting of Sunnis and Kurds. Sunnis and Kurds right now. The moment you take action against them, the international community sees that as a form of legitimate, as some form of approval of international genocide. Isn't that worse under your paradigm then?
No. Why is legitimacy an important factor here to be granted to ISIS in the first place? Yeah. Why is it wrong for us to take that hardline stance and to tell them that we will not negotiate with you because of the extremist mentality, the ideologies that you have employed? Why is legitimacy more important? Justin came and told you that ISIS needs to comply to law. We think we'll take that a step further from closing opposition when we told you, why should Iraq perform that first mover initiatives when there are severe repercussions to the Iraqi government? We told you a number of things. One, this is also about the play between the Iraqi people and the Maliki government as well. Because what happens when you pander towards these extremist sentiments is you tell them that we're weak, that when push comes to shove and we deal with a form of externality that we cannot quell, we will pander. This is the one litmus test that a nascent democracy democracy is facing, in order to establish to not only the global community but to its own people that it can withstand the kind of external threats that it is facing. Pandering to which we think it loses its political value in the eyes of its own people, and that's a sign that we don't want to take. Secondly, we tell you it emboldens the Shia militants as well, because the government, it will be seen as a potential for failure. It's 6. Government, it's a potential for failure. Because militants has every probability of taking matters into their own hands when you dilute the political value of the governments who have pandered to these types of terrorist sentiments. But lastly, we also told you, which is very, very important for closing opposition, is the stakeholder management in which it has with those, it is still and its allegiances in order to perform its duties as a nascent democracy as it wants to progress. ISIS has already threatened to dominate moderate Syrian rebels that are currently funded by the United States. This isn't just about the Iraqi government, this isn't just about the Middle East, it is much more than that. Pandering to which the Iraqi government does this model under opening government, there are vicarious liabilities that are passed on not only to its neighbors but also to the West, and we think this is the form of legitimacy that we can't grant ISIS at the moment, because the liability that is passed on towards the West and towards its neighboring countries dilutes the relationship the Iraqi government will have with its fundamental stakeholders. This benefits no one, but what does this do in the long run? One thing we tell you, that granting legitimacy is akin to heightening the threat to the global community, and we think that is fundamentally important. We're very, very proud to oppose.
Thanks to all the debaters. That concludes this final round. Please wait in the briefing room for the decision, which will be announced after we're done with our deliberation. Next, we'll do. Okay. I